I want to tell you about a case from fairly early in my time doing search and rescue, one that honestly shaped how seriously I take every call-out since, even the ones that seem routine. It involved a family camping trip, a large group, several families together in a designated campground within a national forest. Nothing unusual about the setup at all. A 4-year-old boy wandered a short distance from the group while the adults were breaking down camp, gone for what the family initially estimated as no more than 10 or 15 minutes before anyone noticed. We got the call out within the hour, and given the child's age and the relatively short window since he'd last been seen, the initial assumption across the whole team was straightforward, that we'd likely find him close by, disoriented and scared, but physically fine, the outcome in the vast majority of cases involving young children who wander a short distance from a campsite. The search started immediately, expanding methodically outward from the campsite in the standard pattern for a child that age, factoring in how far a 4-year-old could realistically travel on foot in the time he'd been missing, which by any reasonable calculation put the maximum search radius at well under a mile, given typical child pace and the dense, difficult terrain surrounding that particular campground. We covered that radius thoroughly within the first several hours, dogs, ground teams walking shoulder to shoulder through the underbrush, and found absolutely nothing. No footprints small enough to match a child that age, no torn clothing on branches, none of the small physical traces you'd expect a young child to leave moving through rough terrain. By nightfall, with no sign of him anywhere within a reasonable radius, the search expanded further, bringing in additional resources overnight despite the obvious difficulty and danger of night operations in that terrain. The weather held clear that first night, which at least worked in our favor for visibility, though the temperature dropped enough that everyone on the team was privately worried about a 4-year-old alone in the elements without proper clothing. We continued through the night and into the following day, expanding the search radius well beyond what should have been physically possible for a child that age to have covered on foot, simply because we'd exhausted every closer area without result. He was found on the afternoon of the second day, alive, by a hunter who wasn't even part of our organized search, roughly 8 miles from the campsite, up a significant elevation gain that included terrain our own experienced adult team members had found genuinely difficult to navigate during our search efforts. I want to be clear about what that distance and elevation actually means. Our team's own assessment, done afterwards specifically to try to understand what had happened, concluded that a 4-year-old covering that distance and elevation gain on foot, in that terrain, in that time frame, was not something any of our experienced search professionals believed was physically plausible, even accounting for adrenaline or fear-driven movement, which can sometimes push a person's physical limits further than expected. When he was found, he showed remarkably little physical distress, given what he would have had to endure to get there. Some minor scratches, consistent with brief contact with brush, mild dehydration, but nothing close to the level of exhaustion or injury you'd expect from a toddler traveling that kind of distance through that kind of terrain over more than 24 hours. He was calm when found, not crying, not distressed, simply sitting in a small clearing as though he'd been waiting there for some time. The detail that our entire team still discusses, quietly, among ourselves, years later, is what happened when his parents and the responding medical team tried to ask him what had happened, where he'd been, how he'd gotten so far from the campsite. He had no memory of it at all. Not a vague or confused account, not a child's imprecise sense of time, but a complete absence of any memory whatsoever between playing near the campsite and being found by the hunter, as though no time had passed for him at all between those 2 points. His parents, understandably, pursued every avenue of medical evaluation available afterward, worried about everything from a possible medical episode to the far more frightening possibility that someone had taken him and later abandoned him in that remote location, which, given the distance involved, would have required a level of planning and physical capability on someone else's part that never matched. Any evidence found at the scene, no vehicle tracks anywhere near where he was located, no trail of any kind suggesting he'd been carried or led there by another person. I was part of the team that did a final sweep of the area where he was found, once the medical evacuation was underway, mostly standard procedure to document the scene for the incident report. It was during that sweep that I found something that has genuinely never left me, in a small hollow beneath a fallen log close to where he'd been sitting. His shoes, both of them, removed and placed neatly side by side, laces still tied, positioned with a level of care that didn't match anything a frightened, exhausted 4-year-old would reasonably do on his own, more consistent with someone deliberately, carefully setting them down. He'd been found wearing socks, no shoes, and the family confirmed he'd absolutely had his shoes on that morning at the campsite. The shoes themselves showed almost no wear or damage, nothing consistent with having walked 8 miles through rough terrain in them before being removed, which our team took, cautiously, as at least some evidence that whatever had happened to him during that missing window likely hadn't involved him walking that entire distance under his own power and in his own shoes at all. The case was ultimately closed as a recovery, technically a success given that he was found alive and unharmed, and no further official investigation was pursued beyond the standard child welfare check that follows any incident like this, which found no indication of any concerning circumstances at home that might explain things some other way. I still think about those shoes more than almost anything else from 9 years of doing this work. Placed, not dropped. Tied, not kicked off in a panic. Sitting in a spot that required deliberate care to find and use, tucked beneath that log rather than left in the open. I've never found a way to reconcile that detail with any explanation that makes the rest of the case feel less unsettling. And I've noticed, over the years, that whenever a new volunteer on our team hears this particular story for the first time, they always ask the same question I asked back then, and I've never once heard anyone give them a satisfying answer. Now, going through our next story. This case happened about 4 years into my time doing search and rescue, and it's the one that finally made me start questioning whether everything we deal with in this line of work has a purely rational explanation, something I'd stubbornly insisted on believing up until this point, despite plenty of strange cases before it. We were called out for an experienced backcountry hunter, mid-50s, well-known in the area. Someone who'd hunted that specific stretch of national forest for decades and knew the terrain better than most of our own team did. He'd gone out alone for a multi-day trip, a fairly normal thing for him to do, and when he failed to check in with his brother on the agreed date, the alarm was raised and we mobilized quickly, given how out of character it was for someone that experienced to miss a planned check-in without any warning. The search covered a large area, given how far he could reasonably have ranged in the days since anyone had last heard from him, and included a fairly large open meadow that sat roughly in the center of his known hunting range, a spot our team searched thoroughly on the first full day, walking a tight grid pattern across the entire open area and finding absolutely nothing, no sign he'd been through there recently at all. We continued searching the surrounding terrain for the following 4 days, covering an extensive radius, following up on any possible lead, checking his known favorite spots based on information from his brother, finding nothing that indicated where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. The weather during this search was unremarkable, nothing that would have hampered our efforts or explained an experienced outdoorsman running into serious trouble. On the 5th day, a secondary team doing a follow-up sweep of areas already covered, standard practice this far into an extended search, found him in that exact same meadow we'd searched thoroughly on day 1. He was deceased, and had been for some time based on the initial assessment, meaning, according to every reasonable estimate our team could make, he had likely already been dead in that exact spot, in that open meadow, during our first day's search, when multiple team members walked directly through that area and found nothing at all. I want to emphasize how difficult that is to reconcile with normal search protocol. This wasn't dense brush or complicated terrain where a body could plausibly be missed. It was a clear, mostly flat, open meadow, the kind of terrain where our team's search pattern leaves very little room for genuine human error in overlooking something as significant as a body. Multiple experienced searchers, myself included, walked through that specific meadow on day 1 and saw nothing. The cause of death was ultimately never definitively established, which itself isn't as unusual as people might assume. Extended exposure and decomposition can make it genuinely difficult to determine a clear cause in some cases, particularly without any obvious traumatic injury or clear medical event to point to. What struck our team more than the cause of death itself was a detail 2 of our night search volunteers reported independently, without having discussed it with each other beforehand, from that same first day of searching. Both of them, working separate sections near that meadow during the evening portion of that first day's search, before we called off operations for the night, reported seeing unusual lights in the sky, distant, low on the horizon near the tree line, moving in a way neither could fully describe as consistent with any aircraft or normal light source they were familiar with from years of doing overnight search operations in remote areas. Neither had thought much of it at the time, mentioned it only briefly in their post-shift notes, And it was only after the body was found in that exact meadow, 4 days after they'd reported the lights near that same general area, that anyone connected the two details together at all. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because I don't want to overstate what is, admittedly, a fairly thin connection. Two unrelated reports of unusual lights that could plausibly have any number of mundane explanations. Weather phenomena, distant aircraft, atmospheric conditions doing something unusual with normal light sources. But I've since learned, through informal conversations with more experienced searchers and some of the broader research that exists around cases like this, that this specific combination, an area searched thoroughly and found clear, followed later by a body turning up in that same spot, sometimes reported alongside unusual light activity in the vicinity around the same general time frame, isn't as isolated, a pattern as I initially assumed it was. I don't have any theory I feel comfortable standing behind about what that actually means. I'm not interested in jumping to the most dramatic possible explanation just because a more mundane one doesn't fully satisfy every detail. What I can tell you honestly is that our team's official incident report for that case includes a straightforward, clinical account of a body being found during a follow-up search of a previously cleared area, with no official mention anywhere in that report of the lights either volunteer described, because there was no way to include that detail in any way that wouldn't have felt inappropriate for an official document, and because, honestly, none of us fully know what to do with it ourselves. His family was given as much closure as we could offer, a body recovered, a location established, even without a definitive cause of death attached to it, which for many families going through this is still enough to allow some kind of grieving process to properly begin. I still think about that meadow sometimes, how clear and open it was, how thoroughly our team walked it that first day, and how completely certain every one of us was, at the time, that there was nothing there to find. And this story finished here now, starting another story. Of everything I've dealt with in this work, this is the case I have the hardest time actually talking about out loud, because the ending doesn't resolve the way you'd want a story like this to resolve, and I've never been able to fully make peace with that. A woman in her late 20s went missing on a solo overnight backpacking trip, experienced enough that this wasn't her first solo trip by any means, well prepared by every account her friends and family gave us when we started the search. She checked in with a friend the first night of her planned 2-night trip, said everything was going fine, and never checked in again after that, missing her expected return by a full day before anyone raised the alarm. The initial search found her camp almost immediately, which gave our team real hope early on that this would resolve quickly. Her tent was still standing, gear neatly packed inside as though she'd simply stepped away briefly, nothing suggesting any kind of struggle or sudden emergency. Her pack, her food, her water filtration equipment, all of it left behind, which struck several of us as strange from the very beginning, because an experienced backpacker doesn't typically leave camp for any real distance without at minimum water and some basic supplies, and everything she would have needed for even a short walk away from camp was still sitting there, untouched. We searched aggressively for the first several days, expanding our radius steadily, checking water sources, ridge lines, anywhere a person might reasonably go for a short walk that turned into something worse. Nothing turned up, no sign of her anywhere within a reasonable distance of that camp, despite dogs, ground teams, and air support all covering the area repeatedly over that stretch. The search scaled back after about 10 days, standard protocol once probability drops as low as it inevitably does, though her family, understandably, continued independent search efforts on their own for weeks afterward, distributing flyers, organizing volunteer searches beyond what our official team could continue to justify resource-wise. She was found almost 6 weeks after she'd initially gone missing, alive, by a group of hikers on a trail nearly 11 miles from her original camp, in terrain that would have required crossing at least 2 significant ridgelines and a river crossing that, at certain times of year, is genuinely dangerous even for experienced, well-equipped hikers, let alone someone who'd apparently been alone in the wilderness for over a month with none of her original gear. I want to describe her condition as carefully and respectfully as I can, because this part of the case still weighs on me. She was alive, physically capable of walking, though significantly underweight in a way consistent with an extended period without reliable food access. What struck the hikers who found her, and later our team when we responded, was that she didn't speak at all. Not confused speech, not shock-induced silence that gradually resolved with time and care, but a complete absence of any verbal communication whatsoever for the entire remainder of the time I personally had any involvement with her case. Medical evaluation found no physical cause for the inability to speak, no injury to explain it, no medical condition that would account for it. She was responsive in other ways, made eye contact, seemed to understand basic questions and instructions, but would not, or could not, produce any verbal response at all, communicating instead through simple gestures and, eventually, once she'd recovered enough in a medical facility, through writing. What she wrote, when she eventually did, was limited, and according to what I was told secondhand by a colleague who maintained contact with the family afterward, never actually explained where she'd been or what had happened during those 6 weeks. The family reported that when written questions specifically about the missing time were put to her, she would simply stop writing entirely, put the pen down, and become visibly distressed until the topic was dropped. The one exception, the detail that has stayed with our team more than anything else about this case, came weeks later, well after she'd physically recovered and was staying with her family, when she was given paper and drawing materials as part of some therapeutic process her family had arranged, not connected to our search team at all, simply something we learned about afterward through informal channels. Without any prompting about the missing weeks specifically, she drew, repeatedly, over several sessions, the same basic image. A meadow, trees around its edge, and at the center, a shape she never fully rendered as anything specific, just a dark, roughly humanoid form, always positioned the same way, standing at the edge of the tree line, facing outward toward wherever she'd apparently been standing when she drew it from memory. She never did regain the ability to speak, as far as I know, at least not during the time our team maintained any contact with her case. Her family eventually stopped engaging with search team follow-up entirely, understandably wanting privacy to help her heal in whatever way that ultimately looked like for her. And I respect that completely, even though it means I'll likely never know more about what actually happened during those 6 weeks than what I've just told you. I still think about that river crossing sometimes, the one she would have needed to make to reach the trail where she was found. Dangerous, even for someone at full strength with proper gear. I think about the 11 miles and 2 ridgelines separating that spot from her original camp, distance and terrain that, for someone alone, without supplies, over 6 weeks, simply shouldn't have been survivable in the way it apparently was. And I think about that drawing, the same meadow, the same tree line, the same dark shape standing at the edge of it, over and over, in every version she ever drew, never once changing, never once explained. And this finished here now, next and last one in which I've saved this case for last, because it's the only one on this list that happened directly to me, not to someone I was searching for. And it's the reason I nearly quit this work entirely about 6 years ago, despite everything else I'd already seen up to that point. We were searching for a missing hiker, a young man in his early 20s, gone missing on a trail system I knew extremely well, having covered that specific range on dozens of previous searches and personal hikes over the years. It was a fairly standard call-out, nothing about the initial briefing suggesting this would be any different from the dozens of similar searches I'd participated in before. I was assigned to a section of trail that split off from the main route, an area experienced searchers request specifically because it requires comfort with technical terrain, some scrambling over loose rock, nothing overly dangerous for someone with my experience level, but definitely not a section for less experienced volunteers. I set out alone, in radio contact with the rest of my team, doing a methodical sweep of that section exactly the way I'd done dozens of times before on other searches. I want to describe exactly what I remember, because the gap in what I remember is the entire point of what I'm telling you. I remember reaching a specific rock formation about 40 minutes into my assigned section, a formation I recognized clearly from previous hikes in that area, checking in with my team over radio to confirm my position, exactly standard procedure. My radio log, which I still have access to through our team's records, confirms that check-in, time-stamped normally, nothing unusual in my voice or my reported position according to my team lead who took that call. My next clear memory is standing in a completely different location, a small clearing well off the marked trail, with no memory at all of how I'd gotten there or how much time had passed. I checked my watch instinctively, the way you do when you're disoriented and trying to reorient yourself, and it showed nearly 3 hours had passed since that last radio check-in I clearly remembered making. I want to emphasize that 3 hours is not a small gap for someone with my level of experience and familiarity with that terrain. I've never, before or since, lost track of time or location during a search operation, and my team, when I eventually explained what had happened, confirmed that my radio had gone completely silent for that same 3-hour window, with multiple attempted check-ins from base going unanswered, something significant enough that they'd actually begun preparing to mobilize a secondary team to come looking. For me specifically, before I finally came back on the radio, sounding, according to my team lead, completely normal, completely unaware that any time had passed at all beyond what I remembered. I didn't tell my team the full truth in that moment. I said I'd lost radio signal, which happens often enough in that terrain to be a plausible, unremarkable explanation, and continued my assigned search section as though nothing unusual had happened, mostly because I genuinely didn't know how to explain what had actually occurred, and some part of me, even then, understood that saying it out loud would make it more real than I was ready for it to be. The missing hiker we were searching for that day was found later that same evening, safe, having simply taken a wrong turn and self-rescued back to a different trailhead on his own, resolving the search without incident. I went home that night and didn't sleep at all, replaying that gap over and over, trying to find any thread of memory connecting my last clear moment at that rock formation to waking up, in a sense, in that unfamiliar clearing 3 hours later. Here's the detail that I've genuinely never shared with anyone on my team, including my closest friends within the organization, until deciding to include it here. When I finally worked up the nerve, weeks later, to hike back out to that clearing on my own, off-duty, specifically trying to understand where I'd actually ended up during those missing 3 hours, I found something in the dirt near where I believe I'd been standing when I came back to myself. A single word, written into the soft ground, clearly deliberate, clearly not something that occurs naturally from wind or erosion. My own first name. I don't know who wrote it, or when, or whether it had been there the entire 3 hours or only appeared right before I regained awareness. I've turned every possible explanation over in my head more times than I can count, including the uncomfortable possibility that I wrote it myself, during some period of activity I have no memory of at all, which somehow unsettles me even more than the alternative. I continued volunteering after that, though I've never taken another assignment in that specific section of trail since always finding some reason to request a different area whenever a search brings our team back to that range. I've never told this story to a new volunteer the way I've told the others on this list, the ones about people we searched for. This one, I've kept to myself, mostly out of fear that saying it out loud to the wrong person, at the wrong time, might be exactly the kind of thing that decides whether I get another 3 hours back safely, or whether, the next time, I don't. Now tell me that which one story did you like the most, and also you can share your nightmares directly to my mail.